Good evening and welcome to the Black Robe podcast. I'm Carol Mitchell, one of your hosts for the podcast. My co-host, Anjanae Slaughter, is probably on an airplane right at this moment, off to a much-deserved vacation and a celebration of her birthday. So happy birthday, Anjanae, and we miss you. I want to take this opportunity tonight to just share with our listening audience some of the circumstances that have been clouding our thinking, filling our newspapers, our Twitter feed, our blogs for the last year, really, but especially so since May 27th. Because here in Tacoma and Pierce County, where we live, on May 27th, the Washington Attorney General's office did something historic. They charged 3 Tacoma Police Department officers with a series of crimes, all felonies, as a result of the death of a young man known to us as Manuel Ellis. And what I want to do tonight is read just a little bit of the Attorney General's press release about that charge. And I also want to share with you the medical examiner determinations as to how Manuel Ellis died. And finally, the conclusions and the actual charges that have been brought against those officers. In some ways, it feels as if Tacoma and Pierce County are in the midst of their own George Floyd moment. In fact, Manuel Ellis actually died several months before George Floyd. But as a result of the worldwide coverage of George Floyd's death in May, a lot of energy and interest began to arise beyond Manuel Ellis's family. Of course, they were interested from the very beginning in what had happened to him that night. But our community at large became much more engaged and interested in Manny's case because of George Floyd's notoriety. The similarities in what happened, as you will hear tonight, are striking. And it has just been a week full of turmoil, and camps have emerged on both sides of the issue, as you might imagine. So let me just share a little bit with our listening audience from the Washington Attorney General's May 27th press release. Today, the Washington Attorney General filed felony charges against 3 Tacoma Police Department officers involved in the homicide of Manuel Ellis. The Attorney General charged Christopher Burbank and Matthew Collins with second-degree murder and Timothy Rankin with first-degree manslaughter. He filed those charges, the Attorney General filed those charges in Pierce County Superior Court. If convicted, the standard sentencing range for second-degree murder with no prior criminal history is 10 to 18 years in prison. The standard range for first-degree manslaughter with no prior criminal history is 6.5 to 8.5 years, and the maximum sentence for both offenses is life in prison. Warrants have been issued, so as of the date of this press release, warrants have been issued, and I can tell you that as of the time that you're seeing the podcast, all 3 were arrested and have since been released on bail, each of them on a bail of $100,000 that was posted by a private entity, a private business here in Tacoma and Pierce County. Mr. Ellis was killed on March 3rd, 2020 in Tacoma while being detained by Tacoma police. And let me share with you some of the medical examiner's findings. And the reason why I'm particularly interested in those findings is because of a very personal aspect of my own experience with this case. I was actually in the medical examiner's office Many of you may know that I worked for the Pierce County Executive's Office for 3.5 years, and the medical examiner's office was one of those departments that reported up through my role as the Senior Counsel for Justice Services. And I had an office at the medical examiner's office for the better part of the last year that I worked for the county. It was my habit whenever I arrived at the medical examiner's office to ask, what was the case of the week this week? Because I'd like to be apprised of cases that might have any sort of press coverage or significance because of the way the death occurred, or problematic because of something related to what the family wanted or needed. I wanted to be briefed on those so that I could make sure that the county executive was also briefed and aware. And on that particular week of March 3rd, the medical examiner told me that the Manny Ellis case was the case of the week. And let me tell you about his findings. Pierce County Medical Examiner Dr. Thomas Clark examined Ellis's body. He performed an autopsy and examined the spit hood that was used on Ellis. One of the facts that has come out of this case, and you can actually locate this actual charging document yourself on the Washington State Office of the Attorney General's website, with all the details and facts of what happened to Manuel Ellis that evening. But one of those facts is the point that he at one point had a spit hood put over his face, and Dr. Clark determined that the cause of death was hypoxia, a lack of oxygen due to physical restraint. It sounds eerily like the George Floyd case, doesn't it? In particular, Dr. Clark concluded that the manner in which Ellis was restrained by officers and the application of the spit hood prevented Ellis from breathing properly and caused respiratory arrest and death. Now, one of the things that's come out in the coverage of this case over the past year is the fact that blood samples also showed that there was an amount of methamphetamine in Manuel Ellis's blood. And here's what Dr. Clark said about that even though there was the presence of methamphetamine, Ellis's death was not likely caused by methamphetamine intoxication. And as Dr. Clark has explained, medical personnel arriving on the scene observed bradycardia, a slow heart rate, and conditions consistent with pulseless electrical activity, neither of which is known to be caused by methamphetamine. A slow heart rate and pulseless electrical activity, neither of which is known to be caused by methamphetamine. Dr. Clark has also noted that Ellis repeatedly stated while restrained that he could not breathe. Doesn't that sound familiar to you? He stated that he could not breathe. And according to Dr. Clark, this is empirical evidence that Ellis was experiencing respiratory distress caused by the conditions of the restraint. I want to stop there and talk to you a little bit about what's been happening in Tacoma Pierce County over this last week since this matter came to light, since the Attorney General's office brought these charges. There was a press conference today. Of course, there have been statements made by a variety of entities and organizations, both individuals and groups of people in a lot of different forums. But one of the things that happened today was a discussion by the mayor of the city of Tacoma, Victoria Woodards, the city manager, Elizabeth Pauley, and the interim police chief, Mike Akey, who held a press conference after the afternoon of Tuesday, June 1st. And a number of points came out of that press conference that I wanted to be able to share with you. One of those is the now, what will in essence be a fourth investigative process, and maybe even a fifth investigative process. And I'll tell you why I'm saying fourth or fifth, because it's hard to know which ones we should count and which ones we shouldn't. But the city of Tacoma shared with us today that they will be embarking upon an internal administrative review, which will help them decide what range of discipline, if any, would be applied to the three officers who have now been charged with manslaughter and murder. And in particular, it's important to note that those individuals, along with two others who were involved and on the scene that night, have all been on paid administrative leave for the entire time since this matter came to light. There were moments when they were brought back to work, and then as these multiple investigations happened, they were again put on administrative leave. And so at this point, 5 people on administrative leave, 3 of whom have been charged with felonies and who are facing trial. The point I wanted to make here is that now the city actually has to follow its collective bargaining agreement, its own internal policies and procedures for discipline, and specifically those that apply to police officers. And they're very conscious and very focused on following those policies and procedures carefully, because why? They don't want to make a decision to discipline these officers and then have that decision overturned by an arbitrator or a judge down the road. We just saw this happen in Atlanta, where the officer who was accused of, and perhaps even, he isn't convicted because he's still awaiting trial. Rashard Brooks is the person who he killed. That officer is back at work because the Atlanta Police Department apparently failed to follow the Atlanta City Code for how you discharge a police officer. And so understandably, the city of Tacoma doesn't want to find itself in that same situation. The other points that came out from the press conference on Tuesday, June 1st, were these. Both the city manager, the mayor, and the interim chief all believe and trust the process. They have faith in the rule of law. They trust that these officers will be properly, and whether or not they are guilty, that they will be properly adjudicated, charged, if appropriate, and they have faith in that system. Now, ironically, I don't think that faith in the system is shared by a fairly large share of the Tacoma-Pierce County population, and I myself have my own doubts as to whether or not that system is capable of adjudicating individuals who, for the most part, work with prosecutors on a normal day. So we shall see, and we'll all be watching it very carefully. One other point, and that's who has the authority once that internal administrative review process is complete. Who has the authority to decide whether or not the 3 or 5 officers will be suspended, demoted, terminated, reassigned, whatever the range of options are? The city manager seemed to suggest that there were no limits on what they might be able to do once they completed their administrative process. And she seemed pretty focused on following the law and following that process very carefully. Ultimately, the decision as to whether those officers are terminated is up to the interim chief of police, Mike Akey. Mike Akey reports to the city manager. the city manager, of course, reports to the council and the mayor. But ultimately, the decision as to whether or not 3 people who have now been charged with felonies, police officers who've been charged with felonies, will get to keep their job until they are adjudicated and either found guilty or innocent of the crimes with which they're charged. It's up to Chief Akey. So pay attention, because there will be weekly updates on what the city is doing. The city manager seems to invite, or has at least hinted at, a desire to work with some sort of community oversight process, or to include community members somehow in the process. Although, again, it's Interim Chief Akey who has the call. So make the call, Chief. Make the call. And speaking of chiefs of police, the city manager also pointed out that the process for hiring the permanent chief of police will get back underway sometime in August. They are doing internal planning. Not certain what that is exactly, but certainly if that person is brought on board, that individual will have some influence on the decision that's made with respect to these 5 officers, because you might as well assume it's going to take months to get this done. One final note, which I thought was a little bit humorous, and that is that one of the officers, Mr. Collins, apparently has moved to Oregon and either had a job offer or has a job offer. There's some dispute as to which it is, but apparently had basically started a new life with a new department in Oregon. And supposedly nobody in Tacoma even knew about it. Talk about the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. You're paying for administrative leave. He's already got a new job, or at least at some moment in time had a new job. Now, whether he has it as a result or whether he kept it after he was charged with felonies, perhaps that offer has been withdrawn. Inquiring minds want to know whether or not the city knew that one of its officers had moved out of the state, got a new job, started a new life, and was still on the city of Tacoma's payroll. I've heard of having a side hustle, but a whole new job in a whole new state and a whole new city, that's a serious hustle. I'm going to leave it right there and thank all of you for watching and listening to the podcast this evening. Safe travels for our co-host, Anjanae Slaughter. Hopefully she'll be back with us in the next week. And hopefully you will join us at the upcoming Freedom Summer Symposium, June 28th through 30. Guess what? Due to the generous donations of the Group Health Community Foundation, I want to get that right, the Group Health Community Foundation, and the Black Future Co-op Fund, and South Sound Together. Those 3 sponsors, funders, have made it possible for us to offer the event for free. So if you feel so inclined, you can make a donation. But if you don't have it, just go to Eventbrite and register. Freedom Summer Symposium, June 28th through 30. You don't want to miss it. I'm Carol Mitchell, and I'll see you next time on the Black Robe Podcast. Good night.